questions off our practice test every review session. And so, there we go. So let's take a look at question number 19. Does anybody not have the practice test? Here. Pass that up to Trent. Okay. Question 19. And up until now, I was kind of trying to pick the questions that have been what we just recently have reviewed. And I'll do that on Thursday. But for now, I want to go to questions that I'm pretty sure we're not going to talk about in our regular class. The 1962 book that helped launch the national environmental movement was James Baldwin's The Fire Next Time, Michael Harrington's The Other America, Alice Walker's Search of Our Mother's Gardens, and Jack Kerouac's On the Road, Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. Does anybody know the answer to that?
C.
You would think it would be C, but E, it is E. Rachel Carson's Silent Spring is usually associated with the beginning of the environmental movement. Rachel Carson was from Springdale, I think. You know, it is. Yes, I do. But that is Silent Spring is a very influential book. It was the book that usually is credited with launching the modern environmentalist movement. Oh, what was the name of the guy that we mentioned that was the environmentalist who was the president of the Sierra Club that was a contemporary with Roosevelt? Anybody remember his name? You know, we mentioned him. Remember, Roosevelt is a conservationist, not an environmentalist. But remember we said his buddy who he disagreed with kind of ideologically. Anybody remember his name? Yes. John Muir, right? And that's M-U-I-R, John Muir. Now, okay, go to 54. 54. Which of the following was an achievement of the John F. Kennedy administration? Now, we are going to elect over the next 3 days Kennedy. So we're going to put Kennedy in office over the next 3 days. And we're going to talk probably about Kennedy's actions more so in terms of foreign policy having to do with Vietnam. So the passage of civil rights legislation, passage of bills to create health insurance for the aged and increase aid to education, extension of diplomatic recognition to the People's Republic of China, passage of the Alliance for Progress to provide economic aid for Latin America, passage of the Economic Opportunity Bill. You know, to be honest, I think, is the answer D? Is that right? I mean, I'm not sure actually myself. I mean, it's either D or, I don't think the Civil Rights Act passed in Kennedy's administration. I think it was in Johnson. Same with B. I know Nixon did not, or Nixon opened diplomatic relations with China. And the passage of the Economic Opportunity Bill, I think that was Johnson as well. So is D the correct response?
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, lucky for me that D is the correct response. So we've got that right. So now in the Kennedy administration, the reason that some of those things weren't there is because Kennedy's administration was relatively short. I mean, he's elected in 60, takes office in 61, he's assassinated in November of 63. So he's only a president for about 2.5 years, almost 3 years. Right, so it's a relatively short, he's kind of stymied by really being narrowly elected. I mean, Kennedy is very narrowly elected to the presidency. I mean, Nixon almost beats him. And so he really doesn't have a powerful coalition in Congress to count on. And so he doesn't accomplish much domestically. Most of the legacy of Kennedy is accomplished by a successor, Lyndon Johnson, who was his vice president, and was widely considered to kind of be a legislative genius, you know, very effective in getting legislation passed. Go to 20. During 1968, the deep divisions within the American public were demonstrated by all of the following except. Now, anytime there's an exception question, it's really kind of difficult, you know, because to discern. So we have to see what did not result in deep divisions in America in 1968. The assassinations of Robert F. Kennedy and Martin Luther King, urban riots in major cities across the country, anti-war demonstrations at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, refusal of most Republicans to support Richard Nixon as their presidential candidate, A strong showing of George Wallace's American Independent Party in southern states and some northern urban centers. D is the correct response. Right? D is the correct response. I mean, one of the other things all were sources of tension. You know, race and age are the sources of tension. I mean, gender to a lesser extent, but race relations is a source of tension, and so is the kind of division between young and old. You know, different visions of America, and you can see that manifested in some of those things. But most Republicans supported Nixon for the presidency, so that is not true. Go to 80. This is speaking of the same election. This is the 1968 presidential election. I don't know how much we'll mention of that, you know, before the AP test, but that 1968 is generally considered to be a very turbulent, contentious year. It's in 68 that Martin Luther King is assassinated. It's in 68 that Robert Kennedy is assassinated. It's at the Democratic Convention that there's great, you know, protest. I mean, there's lots of problems, lots of protests, riots in major city in 68. So 68 is a very turbulent year. So they frequently ask questions about that. And there also is an election in 68, right, in November of 68. And it is Hubert Humphrey of the Democrat. It is not Lyndon Johnson. Hubert Humphrey, the Democrat. It is Nixon, the Republican, and George Wallace, Uncle George Wallace, who runs kind of a renewed Dixiecrat party. You know, although he calls himself something else, a third party. So which of the following statements about George Wallace's third-party presidential campaign in 1968 is correct? He appealed to many middle-class voters upset by civil disobedience associated with the civil rights and anti-war protests. I don't think I'm going to go any further. That's the correct response, isn't it? Is that right? Check the back. Pretty sure?
Yes.
Yes. Yes. I mean, Wallace, you know, was expressing what many people kind of were believing, that this had all gone too far, right? That the whole civil rights and the backlash of, you know, protests and you know, riots in major city, and the chaos had gone too far, and Wallace was intended on straightening it out. Go to 59. Which of the following led a campaign to block ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment? So we have no idea about it. We don't even know what the Equal Rights Amendment was. The Equal Rights Amendment was a failed attempt at a constitutional amendment. The Equal Rights Amendment failed in the states. It was passed, I think, by both houses of Congress. It was submitted. And remember, if the Constitution is going to be modified, 2/3 of the House and 2/3 of the Senate have to vote for an amendment, and then that amendment is passed to the state legislatures. 3/4 of the state legislatures have to ratify what was passed by 2/3 of the House and 2/3 of the Senate. This has happened in American history how many times? How many amendments are there? Who's Mr. Spinola? Is it 28? 27? 27 amendments? That happened 27 times. In the first 10, I don't want to say the first 10 don't count, but the first 10 were the Bill of Rights that were passed immediately or, you know, subsequently, very rapidly subsequently after the Constitution was ratified. And so then if you really look at it, 17 other times the Constitution was ratified. Now, to my knowledge, there was only one other failed amendment. The Equal Rights Amendment would have provided for equal rights for men and women. I remember it when I was a kid, and I don't frankly remember the details of why there was opposition. But the leader of that opposition was, in fact, Phyllis Schlafly. She was a conservative female that believed that this was going to be problematic. There was kind of, when the feminist movement began, there was this kind of tension between women sort of asserting themselves in many ways, right? You know, politically, economically, at the workplace, you know, personally, and what were considered to be traditional middle-class suburban gender roles. You know, the idea that women should stay home, tend to the family, you know, make it a haven, like the Leave It to Beaver, June Cleaver sort of 1950s wives, conflicted with kind of an emerging sense of feminism during the time. This is a source of, you know, conflict, kind of a conflict that you don't really see that much currently. You know, I mean, this is where it kind of explodes, because both of those things are there. Well, okay, now let's go back to the French Revolution, right? So I mean, I don't know how many we've done, Jim, but quite a few haven't. We've done quite a few of the terms. And we've been working hard, and maybe we'll finish them. You know, I don't know, maybe we'll finish the whole test, you know, between Thursday and Monday. Maybe we'll just do everything this time. Does somebody have just the ones we've done? Is anybody doing that? Can you do that, Sam? So keep doing that, and then we'll see. You can tell us which ones we haven't done. All right. So when we spoke last, we had established political factions. And what we said is that the political factions in the United States that nobody wanted and nobody thought was productive. I mean, because opposing a Republican government seems to be inconsistent. You know, how do you have an organized faction that's in opposition to a freely elected government? Emerged in response to Hamilton's financial proposals. To the former anti-federalists and even some federalists, their worst nightmare was the power of government would be used for the benefit of some and not all, and that the power of government would be used to oppress the people, the power of this newly created government. And they saw Hamilton's attitude in financial proposals as evidence of this. And we talked about their response to his financial proposals, assumption in his financial proposals. We talked about the Whiskey Rebellion as sort of being the manifestation of really the tension between the two sides. But the French Revolution really kind of intensifies both factions' fears. And that's how you can look at it. The French Revolution made everybody afraid. It made the Federalists afraid, and it made, I don't know that it fully made the Republicans afraid, right? But it certainly made the Federalists afraid. And I think what made the Republicans afraid is the Federalist response to it. Why? What was it about the French Revolution that was so divisive in the United States, given the emergence of those political factions? What was it about the French Revolution? Who has a recollection of the French Revolution? Anyone? How about we start with this? Do you remember anything about the French Revolution? If so, what is it? Go ahead, Vito.
Well, the French Revolution was obviously a revolution, and
yes, it was revolutionary.
It was revolutionary.
Who tended to support the revolutionaries more, the Republicans or the Federalists?
The
Republicans. Why? So the revolution was they toppled the king, eventually executed the king. You know, they attempted to install a Republican government, liberty, fraternity. You know, all of the things that first most Americans greeted the French Revolution as an extension of their own. Eventually, the Federalists are going to cool on it. Why? What about the French Revolution, though, they like? Go, Tony.
Well, they're saying it could potentially happen in America, if not.
What was wrong with it?
There was no control.
So it is anarchy, it is chaos, it's attacks on private property, attacks on religion. Those are the things that the Federalists feared the most. The Federalists feared disorder, right? They feared disorder. They feared that their property holdings, the order in society that was so important to keep things together would be kind of destroyed if the notions of liberty, and the French Revolution was about liberty, went too far. And so really what you see playing out here in the political factions is this kind of dispute between order and stability, which is represented by the Constitution, and liberty, which is represented by the Declaration of Independence. And the Republicans saw the French Revolution as an extension of our own, and the Federalists saw the French Revolution as the worst nightmare of what could happen here in the United States. And so really both sides kind of line up in support or opposition to the French Revolution. And it comes to a head when France kind of tries to trigger the treaty obligations that the United States had with them. The new French revolutionary government is the government of France. The United States had an entangling alliance with France that committed us to assist the French if they fought somebody in the Caribbean. And when France, attempts to trigger that, there is this dispute between the Federalists that say, oh my goodness, This would be a colossal mistake. The financial structure that we have erected in the United States is very fragile. Our trade with England is crucial to maintaining our prosperity. You know, we don't have enough money to fight a war against the British. You know, this would be cataclysmic for this kind of, really fragile Republican experiment under the new Constitution. And the Republicans that were saying, look, this is the wave of the future. You know, liberty is spreading, and we need to do what is our obligation to do to help the people that helped us. Now, eventually, what's Washington's response to a potential demand by France to help them in this war? Washington responds unilaterally. What does unilaterally mean, Jim?
I don't know.
Ashley, what does unilaterally mean? Well, that it's made entirely by him. Unilaterally means I make the decision. Right? I don't consult you. I make the decision. I don't consult Congress. I make the decision. And Janet, unilaterally, what did Washington proclaim relative to the United States, France, and England? How about, say it.
No.
No? You won't say it? Or? How about neutrality? That's an N word too. Or is that? It's a gap. It's a hole, right? Yes, neutrality.
Mrs. Marasco, please come to the front office.
He proclaimed neutrality. And I guess I see what you're saying, Richie. No is what he's saying. No, we aren't going to aid France. No. And the proclamation of neutrality is controversial. And here's why it's controversial. In response to that neutrality, right, the British begin to attack our ship. We said we're neutral, right? We're neutral. And we aren't going to favor England, and we aren't going to favor France. We aren't going to fulfill our treaty obligations to assist the French and enter into this war because it's too damaging, potentially damaging to our country. So Washington proclaims this. There is protest. How can you do this? Why not consult Congress? You're afraid to use troops to help the British, to help the French, but you'll use them against our own people in the Whiskey Rebellion. Now, Washington, like I said, proclaims this, but the neutrality ends up favoring France. And so the British respond to that by trying to attempt to stop us from trading with France. In our view, violating our neutrality. Now, in violating our neutrality, they stop our ships, they impress our sailors. What does impressment mean? When we say impressment, go ahead, Tony.
It means they essentially kidnap them and make them
into the British Navy, which was very difficult. Now, okay, so America is going to assert its neutrality when England and France is fighting. And we're going to have difficulty with this. The British and the French aren't going to like it. The British aren't going to like it. They're going to attempt to stop us from doing this. We're going to protest, right? And, this is an issue that eventually is worked out with a war, the War of 1812. Now, we'll come to that. But I want you to consider this. The same issue emerges in World War I, right? You think about, what happened here. The United States asserts its neutrality in European problems, right? And the British don't like it because they dominate the seas. And so they violate our neutrality, and eventually, to assert our sovereignty, we're going to fight them, right? We're going to fight them. That's the War of 1812. Now, in 1914, war breaks out in Europe. Germany and her allies versus England and her allies. What do we want to be? Wilson says we are to be neutral in thought and in deed, correct? We want to be neutral. And so our neutrality is beneficial eventually as it's kind of configured to England. Right? Now, when our neutrality was beneficial in this first kind of conflict to France, England violated it. Right? When our neutrality was beneficial to England, Germany violated it. How did they violate it in World War I? This is to go flash forward. That was so disturbing to us. Germany eventually, yes, with submarines. They're going to say, okay, no. Your neutrality benefits England, so we're going to stop it. And we're going to fight a war with Germany over protecting our neutrality, just like we fought a war with England to assert our neutrality. But then, coming into World War II, what do? When it looks like we might get involved in this third war, World War II, we surrender our neutrality. The United States passes the Neutrality Acts in 1935 and 1936 and in 1937 that says, hey look, we're going to define our neutrality for ourselves. We're not going to do anything that might be construed as benefiting one side or another in order to stay out of the war. Now, I think we still end up getting into the war because the Japanese don't like our version of neutrality, nor do the Germans, because the Lend-Lease Act is clearly an indication that we're no longer neutral. But anyways, I mean, back to asserting neutrality. You know, that Britain violating our neutrality almost leads to war with Britain. But Washington sends John Jay to England to try to negotiate a treaty with Britain, and the treaty that he negotiates is Jay's Treaty. Jay's Treaty is considered to be a terrible treaty for the United States. It accomplishes very little, right, except for one thing. We said that Jay's Treaty was embarrassing, it was terrible, damn John Jay, damn it. Anyone who won't stay up all night damning John Jay, but it does give us one thing. What is it?
John Jay getting one vote.
That too, but I mean, this might be a little subtle, it's nothing tangible, yes.
The British agreed to leave the Northwest Coast.
Yes, they do, that's true. So that's the correct answer. But what I was thinking is it avoids war. I mean, the alternative to Jay's Treaty was war, and we knew we couldn't afford war. So it avoided war. But it was an embarrassment and a source of continual partisan. I mean, in the aftermath of Jay's Treaty and the Whiskey Rebellion, even the great man George Washington is going to be vigorously criticized by Republicans. And others are going to say, we can't believe that you consider this guy to be the great guy. The criticism of Washington over Jay's Treaty and the Whiskey Rebellion ends up being so kind of, vicious that Washington decides in '96 he is not going to seek re-election, right? So he's not going to allow himself. Remember, Washington never sought election in the first place. He just allowed himself to be elected. But in '96, he's not even going to allow himself to be elected. He said no. And he delivers that farewell address, and that's in the newspapers. That's written. It's not something they ever verbally gave. And so it makes sense that in that farewell address, he kind of attacks the spirit of party, which had been so, because he didn't think he was part of a party, and he warns people to beware of entangling alliances, right? Which seems to be the source of America's problem here, with these people demanding that we fulfill our treaty obligations. In other words, don't do this again. Don't do this again. Don't make the same mistake. Now, we do it again. The first entangling alliances that we get into after this time is really the NATO alliance in 1949. I mean, we come close to it with the Treaty of Versailles, but remember, that was eventually rejected, and the League of Nations was eventually rejected. But in the aftermath of World War II, I mean, I think what Washington was saying is, look, the safety and security of the United States will be much enhanced if we stay out of European affairs and don't get entangled in their alliances. In 1945, we were kind of saying, look, the safety and security of the United States will be enhanced if we align ourselves with Europe, and we join in collective action in the United Nations, and we join in collective action with the NATO alliance. That will enhance our safety. The world was different, right? Well, okay. That sets the stage for the first contested election in American history. And you've got two political parties, and John Adams, who had been the vice president under Washington, and roughly associated with the Federalists, is the Federalist kind of choice. Now remember, at this time, you don't have an infrastructure to nominate candidates for the presidency, right? You don't have that. I mean, the parties, the representatives in Congress basically caucused. They got together and they said, okay, we're going to support Adams. And the Republicans caucused and said, we're going to support Jefferson. And then, people from the states, legislatures appointed electors to the Electoral College, and those guys voted in their respective states and sent those votes off to Washington. They were counted. And Adams,
Oh boy.
look at that. Yes, sir. Those votes were counted, and I think if you have it, Rachel, I think the vote was 71 to 68. And Adams was elected to the presidency. But in a quirk of the Constitution, in a world without parties, Thomas Jefferson, his opponent, was elected to be vice president. Because remember, in the original Constitution, the first vote getter would be president, the second vote getter would be vice president. They had no idea that there would be organized permanent political factions. Right? So Adams becomes the president, and Jefferson becomes the vice president. Now, okay, in the Adams administration, what's the problem? Something we just mentioned. Yes, go ahead.
French Revolution.
Yes, but what specifically? Yes.
French neutrality.
Yes, neutrality, and more specifically, Jay's Treaty. The French resent Jay's Treaty, right? Because they believe, see, if you think about it, the way that it worked is the original neutrality that was proclaimed by Washington benefited France. Then, England harassed our shipping. We signed a treaty with them, and France said, hey, that treaty benefits England. So now we want to fight you. Right? So then now we're going to harass your shipping. So we want to fight them. Right? So we want to fight the French. They want to fight us. They're doing the same thing that England does. And remember, Adams tried to do the same thing that Washington did. Remember, Washington sent an envoy. Adams sends 3. Right? What happens to his attempt to send envoys to negotiate a treaty with France? Does anyone recall? Sarah, do you recall what happened to his attempt? They rejected it, and say more, Jim.
Like the French wanted them to, like, they wanted to bribe.
They wanted to pay a bribe. And what was the whole affair called, Tori? 3 letters. XYZ affair. You see how I did that? I come up with that on the fly. The XYZ affair. There are going to be people on YouTube watching that. They say, that's why they make too much money. Right? XYZ affair, right? You know, is what they call this. And this intensifies. Remember remember we watched that clip of John Adams, no one was paying attention, but you know, he was in that place and the creepy guy was singing, and you know, everybody was said, all of Philadelphia is at your feet, and you know, the anti-French sentiment was high, we're almost at war. What was it called? It wasn't a war. What term do we use our war with France? Remember what term we used? We called it, we weren't formally war.
Like a
Quasi-war with France. One step away, mobilizing for war, raising money, raising troops, building a navy, preparing to fight the French. We do not fight the French, right? But there is this fear, and I think this is interesting in relative to what we discussed today. While, you know, we're almost at war, fearful of war, there is a belief in the United States that there are subversives out there that are going to try to undermine our country from within, right? You know, just like today we talked about the second Red Scare, that these subversives, that we believe that these subversives were out there trying to undermine our country from within. Well, the same thing was true in the 1790s. And a Federalist-dominated Congress responds to this with the Alien and Sedition Acts, which were attempted to muzzle opposition to the Federalist government and to round up and control dangerous aliens, right? We're talking about the French, not Martians. And remember, the Alien and Sedition Acts are kind of interesting because they clearly violate the First Amendment, particularly the Sedition Act, where it was illegal to say things against the Constitution. Well, I mean, or against the government. I mean, this raises an interesting question. I mean, in the 1950s, was it illegal to say that you supported the Soviet Union? Right? Could government persecute you and prosecute you for your opinions if your actions were deemed a threat to the safety and security of the United States? And this becomes an interesting tension. I mean, can a republic effectively fight a war? Right? And that's somewhat resolved in the War of 1812. But in the subsequent wars after that, you know, they're just not extensive enough. I mean, World War II is the final test of that. Can a republic mobilize and preserve its liberties and preserve its traditions and preserve its freedoms in times of war? And we struggle with that in World War II, but come out of it kind of saying yes. Right? So anyways, the Alien and Sedition Acts generate a backlash, and the backlash is the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. Remember we said, look, we know the Sedition Act is a violation of the First Amendment. But the proper place to kind of litigate that would be the Supreme Court that was dominated by Federalists. It was the federal courts that were enforcing this legislation. And so Virginia and the legislatures of Virginia and Kentucky, written by Jefferson and Madison, kind of articulate protests, resolutions in protest of this. And they suggest a definition for the national government in the Constitution. Remember, in the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, Jefferson and Madison suggest that the Constitution is a mere compact, an agreement among sovereign states. So what's the nature of the Union? Here, we start to see it. Are we a nation, one nation under God, a more perfect union? Or are we a confederation or federation of sovereign states? And Madison and Jefferson were basically saying, it's a mere, union of independent states. And therefore, the nature of that union can be interpreted by the Constitution is the union of these independent states. The states that joined into it originally get to determine what is or isn't part of that union. So they can interpret laws made for Congress for themselves and declare the ones that they don't think are consistent with the agreement to be unconstitutional. Now this would significantly weaken the power of the federal government and strengthen the power of the states, which the Republicans increasingly wanted to do because they feared the power of the national government. Now, the issue of the Alien and Sedition Acts is settled when Adams refuses to go to war with France. He seizes the opportunity to make peace, and peace is achieved, but that costs him the election in 1800. In 1800, remember we said the problem for the United States was it was all dressed up with nowhere to go. It had prepared for war, it had built a navy, it had spent money, it had paid taxes, it had done all of these things, and now it had no one to fight, and the Republicans took advantage of that. And Jefferson defeated Adams in a rematch of that election, and Jefferson referred to, and his supporters referred to his election in 1800 as another revolution. Largely because what Jefferson, we mentioned this on Saturday, what Jefferson was arguing is now we're going to do it right. We are going to establish the national government with the principles that were intended to be part of the Constitution, with the principles of the founders in the Declaration of Independence, which he had written. So now we're going to do it right. So this is another revolution. This is a revolution under the Constitution to do the national government appropriately, limited and small and focused on foreign affairs and things that states can't do for themselves. Now, Jefferson is going to try to do this. He's going to try to limit the size of the Army, limit the size of the Navy, cut the size of the national debt. Republicans take the House, they take the Senate, they try to shrink the government. But he has a problem with the judiciary. The federal judiciary is packed full of Federalists. In fact, the Federalists who were in power until March of 1801 are going to make sure that the federal judiciary is packed full of Federalists by expanding it with the Judicial Act of 1801. They expand the federal judiciary with the Judicial Act of 1801. They create new federal judgeships. They create new courts. And then Adams hastily appoints Federalists to these courts. And then the Senate quickly confirms these Federalists. And by the time Jefferson takes office, the federal judiciary is bigger than it ever was and packed full of Federalists. Right? Now, the judges that were placed in positions at the 11th hour prior to kind of, the Federalists leaving office were called the midnight judges. Right? The Judicial Act of 1801 created the midnight judges. The most famous midnight judge was who? Yes?
John Marshall.
John Marshall, who was appointed by John Adams to be Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And he serves in that capacity for 34 years and is always argued to be the most influential Chief Justice in American history. Remember, Marshall was a Federalist, right? He was a Federalist. And so as a Federalist, he is going to enforce the ideas of federalism in his judicial decisions for 34 years as Chief Justice. Now, the first major case, now I should tell you that once the Republicans take over, they pass the Judicial Act of 1802. And really they battle with the federal judiciary, which shrinks the size of the judiciary. But there are other battles, and one of them involves this obscure case of William Marbury not getting an appointment that had been signed, sealed, but not delivered to him, delivered to him. And Marbury goes to the Supreme Court seeking a writ of mandamus, an order to by the court to James Madison, the then Secretary of State, to deliver a commission that had been signed and sealed but not delivered. And Marbury takes his case to the Supreme Court, and the case becomes known as Marbury versus Madison. Eventually, the Chief Justice Marshall and the court rules, and I read the case just recently, it's kind of interesting, ruled that Madison did not have to deliver the writ after all. But that ruling was extremely important. We said it's the most important Supreme Court case. It's one of the ones that you absolutely positively should remember and know. Why? Why would we say something so simple? Look how valuable having Alan here is. People, they chuckle Alan, but they don't realize it. Yes, go ahead.
It establishes judicial review.
Is exactly right. It establishes the premise of judicial review. What is that? Tristan, what is judicial review? What does that mean? Alan is quite right. The man is brilliant. But what does that mean, dear Tristan? Yes, exactly. And we use this term. The final arbiter of constitutionality. The final decider, that's not actually a word, but the final decider of constitutionality is the Supreme Court. So what is or not part of the Constitution, which is an agreement, right? A structure of government. What is consistent with it? What powers do the Senate have? What powers does the House have? What does it mean, the Constitution? The final decisions of the meaning of the Constitution are litigated and decided by the Supreme Court. When is the Constitution violated? When is it not violated? Yesterday there was a big case in Greece, New York. They opened their council meetings with a prayer. Is that a violation of the Constitution? Somebody sued in court, said it is. It is there's in the amendments to the Constitution, the First Amendment, yes, First Amendment of the Constitution says, that the state can't enforce a religion. The state is enforcing religion. Who decided? The Supreme Court. Right? They are the final arbiter. The precedent for that decision was set here. Remember, this is in 1803. In 1796, Jefferson and Madison said, who was the final arbiter of constitutionality? Who did they argue? Yes?
States.
The states. Now, what Marshall asserts is that it is the Supreme Court. And that's why that decision is so important. Now, what Marshall did is declare an act of Congress, the Judicial Act of 1789, that gave the court the authority to issue those writs unconstitutional. So he denied the court power and achieved greater power. But Marshall is not going to, or the Supreme Court is not going to deem an act of Congress unconstitutional for another 54 years. Does anybody know the case? Yes. The Dred Scott decision. So for 54 years after that, the Supreme Court will not deem an act of Congress to be unconstitutional. Now, the Marbury decision is certainly an important one. It's part of Jefferson's, administration. So is the acquisition of Louisiana, which we talked about on Saturday. And I would say this, that Jefferson's first term was really successful. If you take the Marbury decision out of the equation for them, it was a successful first term. Jefferson does what he says. He reduces the size of government. He tries to deal with the federal judiciary, albeit unsuccessfully, and doubles the size of the United States with the Louisiana Purchase at very, very low prices. Right? He does this, and so he's easily reelected in 1804. in his first term roughly corresponded with a time of peace in Europe. I mean, Washington and Adams struggled with European war. The United States was dependent on European trade, so we wanted to trade neutrally. This is a struggle. Both Washington and Adams had to deal with it. Jefferson didn't. For a short period of time, there was relative peace between England and France. But Napoleon goes on march in Jefferson's second administration, and war breaks out between England and France, and so issues of neutrality are resurrected, right? The British dominate the seas. To prevent us from trading with, the people who are supportive of France, England tramples on our neutrality. They oppress our sailors. They confiscate our cargoes. We protest this, right? To the point where eventually we say our protests aren't doing enough. So Jefferson takes action, right, in response to Britain violating our neutrality. What does he do? What action does Jefferson take? Do you remember? It's not war. Go ahead, Tanvir. The Embargo Act of 1807, which was the most intrusive piece of federal legislation ever passed. Its enforcement. Does it work? Does the Embargo Act work? Does Britain, Alan? Not really. It hurts the United States. It decimates New England. It hurts traders. People avoid it. They circumvent it. They smuggle. And Jefferson's popularity is harmed by the Embargo Act of 1807. And there's vigorous criticism of him as well, to the point where Jefferson is going to retire after 2 terms as well. He will not seek re-election in 1808. Washington not seeking re-election and Jefferson reinforcing that establishes the 2-term tradition. Right? Establishes the 2-term tradition. Madison is elected to the presidency, and Madison, really struggles with these issues of neutrality problems with England. Part of what he struggles with is England continues and France continues to trample on our neutrality, but he also has to deal with a new generation of congressmen. Remember, in 1810, out of frustration, many new congressmen were elected. Many from the South and from the West associated themselves with a faction that was known as the Warhawks. They were Republicans. The Federalist Party at this time was pretty much confined to New England and in cities, coastal cities. The rest of the country was basically Republican. And these Warhawks were Republicans, but they were militaristic. They wanted the United States to assert itself. Part of their desire involved problems on the frontier with Native Americans. Now, I know this guy's name is going to be on the AP test, but the Native American leader that attempted to rally the Native Americans on the frontier and battled with William Henry Harrison and other leaders there, and eventually is killed in the War of 1812. Anybody remember his name? Anybody remember his name? Tanvir. Tecumseh. Right, Tecumseh. The AP desperately tries to ask Native American questions, right? So there will be questions about Native Americans on the test, and obviously Tecumseh is an important one. He was considered to be an exceptional person, and his actions are considered to be inspired by Britain. And part of the Warhawks' complaint was, as long as Britain was in Canada, they would aid and abet the Native Americans. They would prevent the frontier from being peaceful. They would encourage the Native Americans to attack our settlers, and what we needed to do was assert ourselves on the high seas and in the country by, basically declaring war on England. I mean, remember we read Madison's declaration of war, and we read the reasons why, people wanted to go to war in 1812, and a lot of it had to do with asserting kind of, America's nationalism, asserting our nationhood, our pride, as a country, on the seas and with the Native Americans and with Canada. There is this declaration of war. I mean, you could debate it. Was it necessary that we go to war with England? Probably not. And really, what did we want to accomplish? kind of secretly, we wanted Britain to respect our neutrality, but we really thought that if we could take Canada, which we don't. The War of 1812, it does not result in the conquest of Canada. It doesn't result really in anything but a lot of controversy. There are, when I say it doesn't result in anything, it doesn't result in any kind of tangible military gains. When the Treaty of Ghent is signed that ends the War of 1812, it ends on the basis of status quo antebellum, which says that everything goes back to the way that it was before the war. The British don't surrender, and say, okay, we'll respect your neutrality, but there's no war to be neutral. The Native Americans are kind of defeated on the frontier, so that transpires. But we kind of argue the reason we believe that we won the War of 1812 is because of the last battle, the Battle of New Orleans, in which Andrew Jackson, who was made by the War of 1812, is going to be victorious over British troops, and we see that battle in conjunction with the end of the war. In terms of conflict, the War of 1812 raises some important issues. New England was so against the war that they actually threatened to secede in veiled ways. The Hartford Convention, remember, was that this disgruntled New England representatives who meet and demand that their minority rights in the federal government be protected with constitutional amendments. There is this, you see this. The New Englanders are the first to do it, say, hey, look, if a federal government is dominated by people that are not New Englanders, they're going to do things like the embargo and the war that are going to hurt us. How can we be protected? Right? We need amendments to the Constitution. And even the South, during the Civil War, they wanted the same thing. The Crittenden Amendments were an attempt to give that to them. We're going to amend the Constitution, but eventually the South is going to say it's not enough. Right? Really what protects the South until 1860 is a Democratic Party. The Democratic Party that was pro-Southern and dominated by the South had dominated the national government until 1860. In 1860, when Lincoln is elected, without any Southern support, the Southerners now knew that they were cooked, they'd have no protection. And the Crittenden Amendments might have worked had Lincoln not rejected them. Right? That might have been enough for some in the South. Right? But that wasn't to be, and they believed at the end of the day, their interest would be far more protected by being independent than it would be as a part of the Union with Northerners. Well, all right. The War of 1812 ends, and the Hartford Convention, and let's just end it there at the end of the War of 1812. We'll pick up with it when we come back on Thursday. That's a lot of stuff. Where'd you like to go? Last review session is online if you didn't make it last night. Garrett was on.
He's the man.
How funny was that when you had Oh my god. So you know how we had NHS meeting? Election.
Tony.